hands where I can see them. Step away from that vehicle right now.
Whoa, officer, this is my car. I live here. That's my house right behind you.
Sure it is. Let me guess, you just bought this Mercedes, right?
I'm reaching for my wallet. My license is inside. The registration's in the glove box.
Andre Williams, this address, everything
I don't
matches.
care what papers you got.
Black guy, nice car. This neighborhood, I know a carjacker when I see one.
Hashtag racist cop arrests black man for stealing his own car. He's undercover detective. Officer terminated Officer Ryan Fletcher. Badge number 7264 with 9 years on the force. Saw a black man unlocking a Mercedes-Benz in an upscale neighborhood and immediately assumed the vehicle was stolen. He approached with his weapon drawn, ordered the man to the ground at gunpoint, and refused to believe the car belonged to him despite seeing the registration showing the man's name and address. When Detective Sergeant Andre Williams calmly explained he owned the vehicle and showed his driver's license matching the registration exactly, Fletcher dismissed it as fraudulent documents and called for backup to arrest him for grand theft auto and possession of stolen property. Despite Williams's repeated statements that he was a police detective with the same department, Fletcher handcuffed him on the sidewalk in front of his own home while neighbors recorded on their phones and shouted that Williams lived there. What Fletcher didn't know was that he had just arrested a 19-year veteran detective who supervised major crimes investigations, that Williams's captain was watching the body camera footage in real time due to an active officer safety protocol, and that his decision to arrest a black man for driving his own car would end with immediate termination, criminal charges for false arrest and deprivation of rights, a $6.2 million lawsuit, and viral body camera footage with 95 million views that would expose a decade of complaints against Fletcher that supervisors had deliberately buried to protect him. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe owning an expensive car while black shouldn't result in being arrested in your own driveway, then like this video and subscribe. Detective Sergeant Andre Williams pulled his Mercedes-Benz S-Class into the driveway of his home at 2847 Oakwood Drive at exactly 7:23 on a Tuesday evening in late October. At 43 years old, Williams was a 19-year veteran of the police department, currently serving as a detective sergeant in the Major Crimes Division, where he supervised a team of 8 detectives investigating homicides, armed robberies, and organized criminal activity. He'd spent the last 11 hours working a particularly brutal homicide case and was exhausted, looking forward to seeing his wife and 2 teenage sons who were waiting inside. The Mercedes had been a significant purchase for Williams. At $87,000, it represented years of hard work, promotions earned through dedication and excellent case clearance rates, and careful financial planning. He'd paid cash for it 6 months ago after receiving a substantial bonus for leading an investigation that had taken down a major drug trafficking organization. The car was registered in his name, insured in his name, and parked in the driveway of a house he'd owned for 12 years in a neighborhood where he'd lived peacefully since his promotion to sergeant. Williams was wearing plain civilian clothes, a button-down shirt, slacks, and dress shoes, having changed out of his suit before leaving the office. His service weapon was secured in his shoulder holster under his jacket, and his detective badge and credentials were in his wallet in his back pocket. He looked like any other professional coming home from a long day at work. As Williams stepped out of his car and pressed the button on his key fob to lock it, he noticed a patrol car slow down on the street behind him. Williams glanced over his shoulder, saw the car pause, then continue down the street. He thought nothing of it. Patrol units drove through this neighborhood regularly. He'd lived here long enough to recognize most of the officers who worked this district, though he didn't recognize this particular car. Williams walked around to his trunk to retrieve his laptop bag when he heard tires squeal behind him. He turned to see the same patrol car had reversed quickly and was now parked at an angle blocking his driveway. A white officer in his late 30s jumped out with his weapon drawn, pointing directly at Williams. "Police, get on the ground. Now, hands where I can see them." Williams's training kicked in immediately. His hands went up, visible and empty. "Officer, I'm a police detective. My name is Andre Williams. I live here. This is my car." Officer Ryan Fletcher had been patrolling this upscale neighborhood for 3 years, and something about the scene had immediately triggered his suspicions. A black man in an expensive Mercedes in this predominantly white neighborhood? Fletcher's racist mind immediately jumped to one conclusion: car theft. In Fletcher's 9 years on the force, he'd developed a pattern of making assumptions about black people in what he considered wrong contexts: expensive cars, upscale neighborhoods, high-end stores, and acting on those assumptions despite lack of evidence. "I said get on the ground," Fletcher shouted again, advancing with his weapon still raised. "Put your hands behind your head and get on the ground now, or I will fire." Williams's heart was pounding, but he kept his voice calm and his movements slow. "Officer, I'm reaching slowly for my credentials. I'm a detective sergeant with this department. My badge is in my wallet. I'm going to show you." "Don't you dare reach for anything," Fletcher cut him off. "On the ground now. Last warning." Williams had no choice. With a weapon pointed at him and an officer clearly not interested in listening, he slowly lowered himself to his knees on his own driveway, then prone on the concrete with his hands behind his head. The humiliation of being face down on his own property, in front of his own home, while his neighbors began emerging from their houses to watch, was almost overwhelming. Fletcher rushed forward and planted his knee in Williams's back, grinding his face into the concrete as he yanked Williams's arms behind him and slapped handcuffs on with unnecessary force. "Don't move. You're under arrest for grand theft auto." "This is my car," Williams said, his voice muffled by the driveway. "The registration is in the glove compartment. My name is on it. My driver's license matches. This is my house. I live here." Fletcher ignored him and began searching Williams's pockets roughly. He pulled out Williams's wallet and flipped it open. Inside was Williams's driver's license, clearly showing his name, Andre Williams, and his address, 2847 Oakwood Drive, the exact house they were in front of. Also visible was Williams's police detective badge and his official department credentials showing his rank, his division assignment, and his 19 years of service. Fletcher stared at the badge for several seconds. A reasonable officer would have immediately released Williams, apologized profusely, and tried to de-escalate the situation he'd created. Fletcher did neither. "This badge looks fake to me," Fletcher said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "Real detectives don't drive cars like this. I think you stole this car and you're carrying fake credentials. That makes this even worse." Williams couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Officer Fletcher," he read the nameplate. "I'm a detective sergeant. You can verify that in 30 seconds by calling dispatch. Call my captain. Call anyone in major crimes. Check the registration in my car. Everything will match. You're making a catastrophic mistake." A neighbor, an elderly white woman who'd lived across the street for 20 years, came rushing over. "Officer, that's Detective Williams. He lives here. That's his car. What are you doing?" Fletcher pointed at her. "Ma'am, step back or you'll be arrested for interference." "I'm not interfering. I'm telling you the truth. He's been my neighbor for over a decade." Another neighbor, a middle-aged black man, was filming from his porch. "This is wrong. Everyone on this street knows Andre. He's a cop. You're arresting a cop in his own driveway." Fletcher's radio crackled. "Unit 7264? What's your status?" Fletcher keyed his radio, keeping one hand on Williams's back. "This is 7264. I've got a subject in custody for grand theft auto. Possible use of false credentials. Request backup and a supervisor." Williams spoke loudly enough for the radio to pick up. "This is Detective Sergeant Andre Williams, Major Crimes Division. I'm being illegally detained by Officer Fletcher in my own driveway outside my own home. Someone call Captain Morrison immediately." Fletcher pressed his knee harder into Williams's back. "Shut up. You're just making this worse for yourself." Within 6 minutes, 3 more patrol cars arrived along with a patrol sergeant. Fletcher stood up, pulling Williams to his feet but keeping him handcuffed. The patrol sergeant, a white man in his 50s named Dennis Cole, approached with a confused expression. "Fletcher, what's the situation here?" "Sarge, I observed this subject with a high-end vehicle in this neighborhood. When I made contact, he claimed to own the car, but his story didn't add up. He's carrying what appears to be a fake police badge and credentials. I believe it's a stolen vehicle and fraudulent documents. Williams spoke before Cole could respond. Sergeant Cole, I'm Detective Sergeant Williams from Major Crimes. I've been with the department 19 years. This is my car, registered in my name, parked at my house where I've lived for 12 years. Officer Fletcher has arrested me based on nothing but the color of my skin and his assumption that I couldn't legitimately own this vehicle. I respectfully request that you verify my identity immediately and end this unlawful detention. Cole looked at Williams more carefully, then at the house behind him, then at the Mercedes. He pulled out his phone and called dispatch. This is Sergeant Cole. I need you to run a name for me. Andre Williams, Detective Sergeant, Major Crimes Division. Confirm his status and current assignment. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, slightly uncertain. Sergeant Cole, Detective Sergeant Andre Williams is confirmed active, Major Crimes Division. Badge number 2847, 19 years service. Sir, his captain is asking what's going on. Apparently Williams's safety protocol flagged when his badge number came up in a field contact. Cole's face went pale. Every detective in Major Crimes had an automatic notification system that alerted their captain whenever their name or badge number appeared in any police system outside of normal work contexts. It was designed to protect undercover officers and detect potential compromise situations. That meant Captain Morrison knew right now that Williams had been stopped. Cole turned to Fletcher with barely concealed fury. Uncuff him, right now. Fletcher's face showed confusion and defensiveness. But Sarge, the credentials could still be fake. We should verify the car registration. Run his prints. I said uncuff him now. Cole's voice rose. That's a direct order. Fletcher reluctantly removed the handcuffs. Williams stood up slowly, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been too tight, brushing dirt and gravel from his shirt where he'd been forced face down on his driveway. Cole stepped in front of Williams. Detective Williams, I apologize for this situation. There's been a serious misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Williams's voice was cold and precise. Sergeant Cole, I was held at gunpoint, ordered to the ground, handcuffed, and arrested in my own driveway despite showing valid identification, despite my car registration matching my license, despite my neighbors vouching for me, and despite my clear identification as a detective sergeant with this department. Officer Fletcher looked at my badge and credentials and called them fake. He saw a black man in an expensive car and decided I must be a criminal. That's not a misunderstanding. That's racial profiling, and it's a violation of my civil rights. Cole had no response because Williams was absolutely correct. Williams pulled out his phone, which was now ringing. He looked at the screen. That's my captain. Excuse me. He answered. Captain Morrison, sir. Yes, sir, I'm fine. Officer Fletcher just released me. No, sir. I was not injured. Just humiliated in front of my entire neighborhood. He listened for a moment. Yes, sir, I understand. I'll wait here. Williams hung up and looked at Cole. My captain is en route. He'll be here in approximately 8 minutes. He's requested that all officers involved in this stop remain on scene. Fletcher's confidence was beginning to crack. I was just doing my job. I saw a suspicious situation and I investigated it. That's what we're trained to do. Williams turned to face Fletcher directly. You're trained to have probable cause before you draw your weapon and arrest someone. You're trained to verify information before you make assumptions. You're trained to believe evidence when it's presented to you. I showed you my driver's license matching my car registration. I showed you my detective badge and credentials. My neighbors told you I lived here. You ignored all of that because your racism wouldn't allow you to believe a black man could legitimately own an $87,000 car in this neighborhood. One of the neighbors who'd been filming approached. Cautiously. Detective Williams, I got the whole thing on video. From when he pulled up with his gun drawn to when he cuffed you to everything he said. You need it. Williams nodded. Yes, please. Send it to this email address. He gave his personal email. And thank you. Captain James Morrison arrived 7 minutes later, along with an internal affairs lieutenant and the department's legal advisor. Morrison was a black man in his early 50s who'd known Williams for 15 years and had personally promoted him to sergeant. When he saw Williams standing in his own driveway with visible abrasions on his face from being forced to the ground, his expression went from concerned to absolutely furious. Morrison walked directly to Williams. "Andre, are you all right?" "Physically, yes, sir. Otherwise." Williams trailed off. Morrison turned to the assembled officers. "Someone explained to me how one of my most decorated detectives ended up handcuffed in his own driveway." Fletcher started to speak, but Morrison held up a hand. "I want to hear from Sergeant Cole first." Cole explained the situation as objectively as he could. When he finished, Morrison's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle was jumping in his cheek. "Officer Fletcher," Morrison said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you saw a black man unlocking a Mercedes and you assumed it was stolen?" Fletcher's face flushed. "I saw someone in a high-value vehicle in a neighborhood where car thefts have been reported, and I made a traffic stop based on reasonable suspicion." "Reasonable suspicion of what?" Morrison asked. "What criminal activity did you observe?" The subject was... He looked. Fletcher couldn't articulate any actual suspicious behavior. "He looked black," Williams said flatly. "That's your reasonable suspicion. I looked black while owning an expensive car." The Internal Affairs lieutenant spoke up. "Detective Williams, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chun from Internal Affairs. I need to collect your statement and all evidence related to this incident. We're opening an immediate investigation into Officer Fletcher's conduct." Over the next 2 hours, Williams gave a detailed statement. The neighbor's video footage was collected, showing the entire incident from Fletcher's arrival through the handcuffing. Fletcher's body camera footage was downloaded, capturing every word including Fletcher's dismissal of Williams's badge as fake, and his statement that real detectives don't drive cars like this. 3 other neighbors provided written statements, confirming Williams lived at that address and the Mercedes was his vehicle. But the most damaging evidence came from the internal investigation that followed. When investigators pulled Fletcher's personnel file, they found a devastating pattern that had been deliberately hidden by supervisors for years. Fletcher had 27 civilian complaints over his 9-year career. 23 involved allegations of racial profiling or harassment of minorities. He'd made 412 traffic stops in the past 3 years. 356 involved people of color despite working a district that was 55% white. His citation rates showed he wrote tickets to black drivers at 4 times the rate of white drivers for the same infractions. His use of force reports showed he'd drawn his weapon in 47% of stops involving black drivers compared to 8% for white drivers. Most damningly, internal emails showed that 3 separate supervisors had been warned about Fletcher's pattern of complaints but had actively suppressed investigations to protect a good officer who made a lot of arrests. They dismissed complaints as oversensitivity, coached Fletcher on how to write reports to justify questionable stops, and in 2 cases had actually altered or destroyed evidence that would have substantiated racial profiling allegations. The investigation also revealed something that made the situation even worse. Fletcher had been in the same police academy class as Williams 19 years ago. They'd graduated together. Fletcher knew exactly who Williams was and had deliberately chosen to treat him like a criminal anyway, perhaps driven by jealousy that Williams had risen to detective sergeant while Fletcher remained a patrol officer, or perhaps simply by racism so deep that even knowing someone personally couldn't overcome it. The department moved swiftly. Officer Ryan Fletcher was terminated within 72 hours, the fastest termination in department history. The police chief held a press conference calling the incident a disgrace to the badge and announcing immediate policy reforms. 3 supervisors who'd suppressed investigations into Fletcher's conduct were also terminated for misconduct and obstruction. The district attorney's office reviewed the evidence and filed criminal charges against Fletcher: deprivation of rights under color of law, false arrest, official misconduct, and filing a false police report. The combined charges carried up to 12 years in prison. Detective Williams filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking $6.2 million in damages. The city settled within 8 months for the full amount rather than face a trial where they'd have to explain how they'd ignored 27 complaints and protected an officer with a documented pattern of racial profiling for nearly a decade. The settlement required comprehensive reforms: independent review of all racial profiling complaints, termination of any officer with 3 or more substantiated bias complaints, body cameras that couldn't be turned off, quarterly public reports on stop data by race, and civilian oversight with real investigative authority. Fletcher's trial lasted 5 weeks. The prosecution presented devastating evidence: body camera footage showing him dismiss a detective's badge as fake, his statement that real detectives don't drive cars like this, which proved assumption based on stereotypes, statistical analysis of his stop patterns showing systematic racial bias, and testimony from 8 citizens Fletcher had profiled over the years, including a black neurosurgeon, a Hispanic attorney, and an Asian American business owner, all of whom had been stopped and harassed for driving while non-white. The jury deliberated 14 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all charges. At sentencing, the judge showed no mercy. "Officer Fletcher, you didn't just violate Detective Williams's rights. You betrayed every principle of law enforcement. You saw a colleague, a decorated detective, and you treated him like a criminal because of his skin color. Your actions weren't just racist. They were a betrayal of the oath you swore to serve and protect all citizens equally." Fletcher was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. At 39 years old, he would be 49 at his earliest release. The body camera footage went viral, reaching 95 million views. It was used in police academies across the country as a definitive example of racial profiling. Civil rights organizations used it in training on how implicit bias leads to rights violations. And it became a rallying cry for reform advocates who argued that if a decorated detective could be arrested in his own driveway, then the system was broken at its foundation. The case also sparked a national conversation about the protection of officers who engage in racial profiling. Congressional hearings were held examining how police departments shield problematic officers from accountability. The Justice Department launched investigations into 34 police departments with similar patterns of suppressed complaints. Reform legislation was introduced requiring federal reporting of all racial profiling complaints and outcomes. Williams's case became a touchstone for the movement to end qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that protects officers from civil liability for constitutional violations. Legal scholars cited his case in briefs, arguing that if supervisors could bury 27 complaints and protect an officer who later arrested a colleague, then the system of internal accountability had completely failed. The 3 supervisors who'd protected Fletcher faced their own reckoning. All 3 were fired and faced criminal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Their trials revealed a culture of protecting officers at all costs, where complaint investigations were deliberately mishandled, where evidence was hidden or destroyed, and where officers who reported misconduct faced retaliation. 2 of the supervisors were convicted and sentenced to 3 and 5 years respectively. The third took a plea deal and testified against the others in exchange for probation. The police union initially tried to defend Fletcher, issuing statements about how officers must make split-second decisions and shouldn't be second-guessed. But when the full extent of Fletcher's record became public, when the union's own members who were minorities came forward with stories of Fletcher's harassment, and when it became clear that Fletcher had knowingly arrested a fellow officer, the union quietly withdrew its support and Fletcher fought his case alone. 5 years after that October evening, Detective Sergeant Andre Williams had been promoted to lieutenant and was serving as the commander of internal affairs, where he'd created new protocols for investigating bias complaints and had personally investigated 47 officers, resulting in 23 terminations for patterns of discriminatory conduct. His work had become a model for other departments attempting to root out racist officers before they could do the kind of damage Fletcher had done. Williams still drove his Mercedes. He still lived at 2847 Oakwood Drive. His sons, now both in college, had grown up understanding that even their father, a decorated police detective, wasn't immune to being profiled. That lesson had shaped their understanding of systemic racism in ways that no amount of conversation could have taught. The neighborhood where Williams lived had changed too. The incident had forced uncomfortable conversations among neighbors about the assumptions they'd made, about the times they'd seen black visitors or service workers and wondered if they belonged, about the subtle ways racism manifested in their community. Some neighbors had responded with genuine introspection and commitment to change. Others had quietly moved away, unwilling to confront their own biases. Ryan Fletcher was 44 years old, serving year 5 of his 10-year sentence in federal prison. He'd applied for parole twice and been denied both times. The parole board had noted that Fletcher showed no real remorse, continuing to insist he'd just been doing his job and that he'd been unfairly scapegoated for systemic problems. His lack of insight into his own racism, his inability to accept responsibility for his actions, and his continued belief that he was the victim in the situation made him, in the board's assessment, unsuitable for release. In prison, Fletcher had discovered what many officers find: that inmates have no sympathy for cops, and particularly no sympathy for racist cops who'd abused their authority. He'd been assaulted twice, once by inmates who were friends with someone Fletcher had previously arrested on questionable charges, and once by inmates who simply saw beating up a racist cop as a form of prison justice. He spent most of his time in protective custody, isolated from the general population, with years still remaining on his sentence. The lesson of Andre Williams's arrest resonated far beyond one driveway in one neighborhood. It became a case study in how racism in policing persists even when victims have power and status, how supervision fails when supervisors care more about protecting officers than protecting citizens, and how body cameras and community witnesses can force accountability even when departments try to bury the truth. Williams himself became a national speaker on racial profiling and police reform. He testified before Congress, consulted with the Justice Department on use of force policies, and trained thousands of officers on implicit bias and constitutional policing. He never let audiences forget that he was arrested while black despite being a 19-year detective, despite owning his car, despite being in his own driveway, despite showing his badge, and despite his neighbors vouching for him. If it can happen to me, Williams would tell audiences, then imagine what happens to people who don't have a badge, who don't have supportive neighbors, who don't have body cameras recording, who don't have a captain willing to fight for them. That's where the real injustice lies. In all the cases we never hear about because the victim didn't have the power to demand accountability. The Mercedes that Williams drove became something of a symbol. He'd been offered money by collectors who wanted to buy the car that had been at the center of such a significant case. He'd refused every offer. "I bought this car with money I earned through hard work," he'd say. "I'm not giving it up because a racist cop couldn't believe I owned it." That would be letting him win. Fletcher's case also changed how police departments across the country handled complaints. The revelation that 27 complaints had been buried led to federal legislation requiring independent review of all excessive force and racial profiling complaints. Departments could no longer investigate themselves. Civilian oversight boards with real power became the norm rather than the exception. The $6.2 million settlement Williams received was the largest in the city's history for a wrongful arrest case. He used $3 million of it to establish a legal defense fund for people of color who'd been victims of racial profiling by police. The fund provided free legal representation to people who couldn't afford attorneys, and in its first 5 years, it had won settlements or judgments in 67 cases, totaling over $18 million in damages against police departments and individual officers. Williams also purchased the body camera footage from his arrest and made it freely available to educators, activists, and researchers. It had been viewed in thousands of classrooms, used in hundreds of training sessions, and cited in dozens of academic papers on racial profiling and police accountability. The footage was particularly powerful because it showed how racism operated even when the victim was doing everything right, had every credential, every proof of legitimacy, and still couldn't overcome an officer's predetermined assumptions. The reforms that followed Williams's case extended far beyond his city. States passed laws requiring data collection on police stops broken down by race. Patterns like Fletcher's, where officers disproportionately targeted minorities, became easier to identify and harder to hide. Officers whose stop patterns showed racial bias faced mandatory retraining or termination. The era of protecting problematic officers was ending, largely because cases like Williams's had made the cost of that protection too high. 10 years after his arrest, Williams was a deputy chief, one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. Fletcher was still in prison with parole repeatedly denied. The supervisors who'd protected Fletcher had served their sentences and been released, but all three had lost their pensions and would never work in law enforcement again. The video continued to circulate with millions of new views each year. Every time a new case of racial profiling made headlines, Williams's arrest resurfaced as evidence that the problem was systemic and persistent. Every time a police department claimed they'd solved their bias problem, activists would point to Williams's case and ask how a department could let an officer make 27 complaints disappear if their accountability systems worked. The lesson remained permanent, expensive, and clear. Owning nice things while black isn't probable cause. Being a police detective doesn't protect you from racial profiling by your own colleagues. Supervisors who bury complaints to protect racist officers will eventually face criminal charges themselves. Body cameras and community witnesses can force accountability even when departments resist. And racism in policing will cost everything to those who practice it and those who enable it. If you believe no one should be arrested for driving their own car in their own driveway, share this story with everyone who needs to understand that racial profiling destroys trust, ruins lives, and will cost those who practice it everything they have. What reforms would prevent officers from targeting people based on appearance rather than actual criminal behavior? Drop your solutions in the comments. And if you think 10 years in prison for arresting a fellow officer based on racism is exactly the justice we need, subscribe because we're bringing you more stories where accountability catches up to those who think their badge protects them from consequences.